Good evenings, lovelies, and gems. As always, I'm your host, Liz Sissio. Welcome to the Nightcap News and Commentary, the poorly prepared, ill thought out portion of the week where I rant about whatever it is that I've been thinking about this week. So I've got my webcam all super funky today. Just all kinds of messed up over here. And all the same, no big deal. We're just going to go for it. So last week, we went on about the hemp revolution, which I will be screaming about off and on till my dying day, certainly throughout what I hope is many, many episodes of this show. And also, I kind of alluded to, I don't know that I spent much time on it, but I know I kind of alluded to the idea that hemp was not only good for the environment, which I know I went on and on about, but also incredibly good for our economy. Now, when I say the economy, I mean something very different, I think, than economists mean, because economists are looking at GDP and they're looking at employment numbers. But when I'm talking about the economy, I'm talking about the economy that you and I actually deal with every day. The cost of childcare, the cost of a gallon of milk, the cost of a loaf of bread, the cost of gasoline in our cars, our economic environment. That's what I mean by economy. Now, who and where you are in the economy, and this is no secret, no surprise, vastly changes your opinion of how the American economy is actually doing. But for most of my adult life now, for many decades now, average Americans, even in the $150,000 a year to $250,000, $300,000 a year income level, have known that there are deep issues in the economy. I remember my parents talking in the Reagan years about how Reagan's financial plan, his economic plan, was going to destroy the middle class. That was a household conversation in the 80s. And when I was just old enough to grasp that the grown-ups were probably talking about something interesting. And I didn't really know about economy, and I didn't understand taxes, and I didn't really get, well, actually, the only part of that whole concept that I think I actually understood was middle class. And I understood middle class because my mom had told me that we were on the lower end of the middle class, but that we were middle class. And this was back when she thought it was outrageous to spend $100 on groceries for a month for a family of four. So, turns out everybody I knew, and these were Republicans, by the way. My parents were Republicans. My grandparents, I believe, are basically Republican. It's my understanding that my grandparents always picked one person from each side to vote for, and they would discuss the candidates between the two of them, and then one of them would vote Democrat and the other one would vote Republican as a matter of course to keep the balance. Which in terms of a marriage is lovely and adorable. In terms of good political thinking is awful. Anyway, well, it turns out all the people who criticized Reagan's economic policy and were said that it would destroy the middle class were absolutely right. That is exactly what it did. And in fact, it opened the door to make increasing opportunities for the banking industry and the real estate market and all these other markets to really take off and begin to control a larger and larger sector of the economic growth, as opposed to actually allowing the free market to decide. Now, if there were a free market, which there's never been, there wouldn't be such a thing as illicit substances and illicit products or illicit goods or services of any kind. A free market assumes that whatever the people are willing to pay for is a legitimate form of market. It is free of restriction and inhibition. But in addition to not actually ever applying to a market in which there are illicit goods or substances or services, a free market also would be free of all government subsidies, because every government subsidy is the government um, picking and choosing one industry over another. So when we talk about oil subsidies, we're saying the government is choosing to invest. It is picking the oil industry over wind, solar, hydro. And a free market cannot have that kind of mechanism. If it does, it's not actually a free market. We don't have free market capitalism. We have vulture capitalism, but I'm sure you all know that. But what I wanted to talk to y'all about tonight is, I guess, a little bit more social than it is about actual economics. Because what we have now is a deeply divided class system with, and this is plain for everybody to see, with a ruling class of incredibly wealthy oligarchs who control the media, who control policy, who control corporate policy, who control legislation, and everybody else who is subject to whatever taxes and policies have been decided upon by those wealthy elites. That's a very lengthy way of saying we live in an effective oligarchy. And we do. Princeton confirmed that actually quite a while ago, back during Occupy. So the thing is, where you have a ruling class that has the ability to, but refuses to alleviate the suffering of average citizens, that refuses to care for or address the needs of the disabled, the impoverished, and the disenfranchised, that is class warfare. When you price insulin out of the ability of the poorest diabetic to get that insulin, that is class warfare. When you price workers out of their houses so that they don't have a stable place to live, but you still expect them to show up to work, and if they cannot, you call them lazy and disenfranchise them from society altogether, that is class warfare. When you allow policies to flourish that protect banks, protect law enforcement, protect real estate, protect investors, protect shareholders, protect lawyers, but not dishwashers, janitors, teachers, that is class warfare by definition. And when you do that, crime will surge, poverty will surge, desperation will surge. That is class warfare, because at the end of that line, All the time, every time, in every society lies death and ruin. And our society consistently ignores this really pretty basic reality that, when we step out of putting it in a specific time and place, talking about a specific country. I mean, that's just algebra. It obviously poverty leads to crime and desperation leads to death. That's not mysterious. But we ignore that and have replaced it with a narrative that blames and the blaming the poor for their own poverty, that's a game as old as time itself. But we've used some very specific propagandized mechanisms to do this. We have embedded it into our cultural conversation on finance and managing finance. And it's really pretty disgusting. I want to see if I can pull it up here real quick. There was an article in Bloomberg. It was an op-ed in Bloomberg where an economist wrote this. It was such a garbage piece of writing. I really thought we would have done away with pieces of writing like this after 2010 and 2014, but no. She starts off by talking about how if you make more than around $250,000, don't worry about gas prices. You only spend about 1% of your income on oil and gas anyway. The gas issue won't be affecting you. The cost of food will not be affecting you. The rise in the cost of food won't be affecting you. Of course, she fails to mention that only 1.6 of all American households make above $250,000. 1.6% of all American households make above $250,000. That's class warfare. Because $250,000 in our economy is basically upper middle class. It's not rich. It's not wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. It's not the 1%. Not even close. So she starts off by saying that if you are in this 1.6% of all American households above this, you'll be fine with the rise in gas prices. She goes on to say, for everybody else, and then she gives you a list of things that you should do to combat the rise in gas and food prices. And it is, as all articles framed this way that I have ever read have been, a list of hogwash. She talks about eating beans and lentils. She talks about, I think the most egregious thing that she said was for all you people, all you millennials and so forth who I can't remember how she phrased it. I'm paraphrasing. All of you who may have gotten pets during the pandemic, you might want to consider those petly vet costs and maybe surrender your pet. I am paraphrasing, but she recommends not spending $10,000 on pet chemotherapy. I got to say, if you adopted a pet during the pandemic because you were lonely and you didn't fall in love with that pet, that is a whole different issue. If you're going to get rid of your pet because it suddenly became financially inconvenient, you didn't deserve to have one in the first place. Just on a real human level here. Okay? That is ridiculous. People who can spend $10,000 on their puppy or their kitty's chemo should be able to do that. just what a ridiculous thing to say. How unbelievably elitist and pretentious is that suggestion all the way around? Humans don't love from their pocketbooks. When they do, it's not love. She also makes a comment in this article about considering taking public transportation. And again, that is such an impractical suggestion for so many of the people who legitimately are affected by inflation and our pretty horrendous economy. Why? Well, in theory, I'm a big believer in public education. In practicality, public transportation. In practicality, it presents some serious challenges. First, as financial advice, it ignores reality that there are many, many, many towns and cities throughout the United States that still do not have reliable public transportation that actually gets people where they need to go in a reliable way on time without having to wait weird, wonky hours and then catch a bus 2.5 hours before you actually have to be at the place that you're supposed to be. Public transportation has a bunch of limitations. It's very difficult, for example, to buy a month's worth of groceries at the grocery store and then carry them on the bus or the train back to the house. I remember my mom used to tell me all the time, "Why don't you take the bus, honey? Why don't you take the bus, honey?" And one day she called me very out of the blue. And she said something to the effect of, "I want to apologize to you for always suggesting you take the bus." And I said, "Oh?" And she said, "Yeah, well, the car's in the shop this week, and I had to take Liberty, who was a baby at the time. I had to take Liberty to go get groceries, and I thought, oh, I'll just take the bus. And between the strollers and the groceries, um, I realized why you always hated that suggestion." I was like, "Oh," I felt really bad for my mom. I feel bad she found out the hard way. But that's just reality for thousands, probably millions of women. Holding a baby in one arm and groceries in the other, and then getting on public transportation, which you have to pay extra for. I mean, the price of public transportation has always also gone up. As the article pointed out, this Bloomberg article I'm referencing, public transportation has gone up nationwide only by about 8%. You may not have seen any increase in your area, or you may have seen a fairly sizable jump, but overall it's gone up 8% as opposed to gas, which has gone up 38%. So from an economic standpoint, it would seem that public transportation is less expensive. But that's not really how it works out. I have priced out what a monthly bus pass costs me versus the cost of gasoline. Now, a bus is more economical if you remove registration and insurance from the equation. And at current gas prices, it's more economical than gas is right now. But at the time I last did this measurement 2 years ago, it was more or less on par. That was during pandemic gas prices. So those were abnormally low. This is class warfare. People who can't even get to their jobs because they can't afford gas to get to their jobs, and rent to pay their rent, and food to fill their fridge. They're going to cut somewhere. People start cutting corners somewhere, anything to ease the burden. What happens? They start sleeping less. I did a lot. I have never been a big sleeper. Um, my brain turns on. I swear my brain at 10 o'clock at night goes, ooh, nighttime thinking, let's go. And, and I'm awake, I'm alert, and I'm thinking about all kinds of stuff. Like the whole day, my brain is just going through the motions of my life. And at 10 o'clock, it's like, all right, me time. So I have always struggled to fall asleep at a reasonable hour, but I did a lot of research. I was starting to struggle in my world a little bit, and I did a lot of research trying to figure out all the reasons I might be struggling. And the big thing that came up just again and again and again, because I basically had brain fog all the time, was you need to sleep more. Um, we don't sleep nearly enough in our society. It's probably the single biggest corner we cut. Millions of Americans report undersleeping by fairly wide margins. We make it a flex. I get 5 hours of sleep, you hear me? And I can go. Well, yeah, you can, for a long time. But there is a point of diminishing return, and you are not functioning at your best executive level when you are sacrificing sleep to finally get that me time, to finally work on that project. But that's the number one corner we cut. We also don't eat well. The more desperate and poorer we are, the more we start drinking the sugary drinks and eating the food that comforts our souls rather than the food that is truly nutritious for our body. Now, for some people, it's the food that comforts their soul just happens to also be super nutritious, and for them, good on you. For many people, the price of healthy food, particularly healthy comfort food, is way beyond them. And so what do they do instead? They go for that gelato. They go for that ice cream. We all have a dessert or a candy or something that we're like, yeah, I know it's bad for me and I don't care. Give me that easy cheese, baby. Hell yeah. But that's also class warfare. Allowing ourselves to live in a state all the time where we're just not taking care of ourselves is killing us. We got drama. Trailer park girls going around the outside all day, every day. What do you think causes that? You think people just went crazy all of a sudden? Well, what causes that, in my opinion, okay, this whole show is my ill-conceived opinion. But in my opinion, what causes the drama is that people have no purpose, no destination, and their futures are bleak at best. They're stuck in a position where all of their big dreams seem impossible from where they're standing. They can't afford to go to Juilliard or Princeton. It's not cool in their culture to want to be a lawyer or a scientist. Because what many people do all day, every day in their neighborhoods is try to survive living in their neighborhoods. Making sure that at least there's mac and cheese on the table for the kids. And again, that won't kill you right away. You can go like that for a long time. But sooner or later, you're going to get to a point of diminishing returns. Your quality of life, your ability to think, your ability to solve your own problems, your entire executive function in a shorter time than we're going to discuss here, because I don't want to scare people, is severely compromised. And this is where millions of Americans live. I live in poverty. Most of my friends live in poverty. And what's sad is that those of us who have houses and make the rent every month know that our poverty, our squeaking by paycheck to paycheck, isn't even as bad as it gets. I know a lot of people who don't think that there's real poverty in America, but there is. There's a lot of it, and it kills people. And that is class warfare. Class warfare starts at the top, where anarchy also stops. Starts. Starts. But we only call it class warfare when the people fight back. One of the ways that the Occupy movement was so effectively dismantled was to paint occupiers as radical, disorganized communists, only interested in tearing down society and attempting to start a class war. The police brutality issue in this country is always confused and clouded because it exists in three realms. Policing in the United States has a racist history and a racist roots, and it has from its very inception. Police training and many police are militarily informed. They are informed by ex-military, they are informed by military tactics, they are equipped like military, and they are taught to think in militaristic ways, do what I tell you to or else. So it's an authoritarian training. Also a training that does not focus on or respect the rights of citizens to be citizens. I've questioned before, do Black people have a right to the Second Amendment or don't they? Because in effect, it sure does not seem like they do, except that the law says they absolutely do. And then the third realm of this is that the police also go after the poor in general. If you are poor in this society, just like if you are Black in this society, you're not going to get a fair shake by the judicial system, really by any part of it. Once the police have made their assumptions and have you in cuffs, the system is going to do, well, it's going to Kafka right all over you. And we all know that. We've all been either been victims of it ourselves or know plenty of people who should not have been victims of it get absolutely trampled by it. Now, the courts are not kind to people who don't have money to feed their pockets. That is class warfare. Putting people in prison because they can't pay fines is class warfare. Criminalizing behaviors such as loitering and making a buck without the government say so, that's class warfare. They only start screaming that it's class warfare when we're like, eat the rich. By the way, thinking of eat the rich and the other side of class warfare, while the anger of average citizens is certainly understandable, and it's clearly a response to the fact that people in poverty die because of the policies of the moneyed classes. There is always a danger in looking at those above you with envy and those below you with Scorn. And I'm talking about above and below on an economic level, because I fully believe that as human beings, our economic status doesn't have a thing to do with any of the stuff that counts about you and me as human beings. What counts? Are you kind? Are you thoughtful? Do you have integrity? Are you honest? Are you sincere? What has value? What do you create? What do you love? What are your passions? What do you do that makes the world a better place? That's your value. But when poor people rise up in rage and anger and try to fight back, well, we saw how that went down. Actually, we saw how Occupy went down. We were dismantled rather brilliantly, mostly by the media, by the moneyed classes. They did a good job. There were things that occupiers in many cities did that did not help their own case whatsoever, that they did all by their little lonesomes, because we're so caught up, each and every one of us, in our own narratives and our own needs. So the next move was to try to run a candidate for office. And to be fair, although it was still a failed strategy, it was a much better strategy. That candidate, of course, I'm referring to Bernie Sanders, who's probably the best American politician that in the United States today. And by European standards, he's right in the dead middle. He's like actually a centrist politician by European standards. He's only considered radical left here in the US, where in fact people like Barack Obama are actually to the left of right. Now, that campaign changed the conversation about money. It brought more than just angry teenagers to the conversation about taxation. And yet, not only did we not elect Bernie Sanders, but the policies that we wound up instead electing Donald Trump, and he did exactly the opposite of what he promised to do. He actually relaxed taxes even more on the wealthy and put them even more on the backs of the working and middle class. So we've had decade after decade after decade of policies that have taken money from Social Security, the social safety net in general, at the state level and at the federal level, out of education, into prison systems. This is class warfare. So I don't know that I've made all my points the way I wanted to necessarily tonight, but I've got some comments to get to. Let's see. Oh, hello, Anaya. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. I'm so glad to have you here. Do you do it, dear Peter? And Katie, hi. Hi, hi, hi. John, hi. Everybody who came tonight, thank you so much. So Anaya says, we're beginning to follow the pattern Orwell described in 1984 in Animal Farm on a terrifyingly identical level. Yeah, Soil and Green, anyone? No, we really are. Inform on your neighbor, watch everything in addition to all these other social controls. Let's see. Peter here makes a comment about especially rural folks who commute to work. Yeah. So people in rural areas actually don't even necessarily have any bus system at all. But even in like the small towns where they've got a smaller bus system, I'm talking about towns approximately, trying to think of something relevant that you might all know in terms of size. There probably isn't one. But, small towns that do even have their own bus system, public transportation is getting crazy, crazy dangerous too. Um, Actually, it's been crazy dangerous. What's been happening on subways, on trains, and on buses across the United States has been dangerous. This was a point I meant to make earlier. I kind of tangented off away from it. But for all the positive about the idea of public transportation, the reality of it can be nightmarish, not just in terms of all the stuff you might be carrying to and from work or the grocery store, or having to rely on public transportation to take care of all of your household's needs is really kind of daunting at best. But in Philadelphia, a year or two ago, a woman was raped on a train in full view of many other people, none of whom stopped to help. I, that story just still gets me. Women have been pushed in front of trains, people have been stabbed on trains. Um, Trains, subways, and buses can also be very dangerous places to be. Not to mention, we're still coming out of COVID. A lot of people aren't necessarily going to want to jump onto public transportation. I know that I actually will like take my jacket sleeve and pull it over my hand, when I go to grab the bar on the bus. It's not that I'm a germaphobe, but we're kind of in the middle of a pandemic, and the people who don't wash their hands and didn't take the virus seriously are still touching everything. So, that's the whole point. They didn't take any precautions, so now the rest of us have to take more. Um, so in general, there are dangers and impracticalities that come along with bus, subway, and train service in most cities. There are some cities, I am very lucky. I live in a city with great public transportation. Even I know it can be dangerous. And then I know a lot of cities where the whole system, the whole public transportation system is not manageable, legitimately not an honest option for, well, frankly, the people who would need it the most. Um, that's an interesting point. Thank you for bringing this up, John Harbeck. Humans compensate for their guilt with their pocketbooks. This is not love. This is more of a way to try to attempt to make up for feeling that they have slighted someone emotionally. Yeah. Anaya, as a delivery driver, I had to stop taking low tip orders, though those are usually my nicest customers, because I have to average $9 an order with a $2 to $3 base pay to afford my bills and fuel. That's that's reality right there. That's reality right there. Some of your best and nicest customers um, are also some of the ones who, first of all, need their money the most, can afford to pay the least, probably need the service the most. And yet the delivery drivers literally also cannot afford to deliver to them because nobody has enough money to get that done. So when I'm talking about, when I say economics, that's the economics I'm talking about. This is class warfare. The delivery driver suffers. The people who need the deliveries suffer. Nobody makes money in that. That is an example of the type of lose-lose transaction that actually, or rather lack of transaction, that actually goes down in the United States every day. All the things we didn't buy, all the services we couldn't get, and then the people who provide those services are also not making money. It's bad business. We put great point by John also. We put former soldiers with PTSD in police uniforms and hand them guns. Like that's a good idea. Let them fight people of color in impoverished areas, then put them in similar neighborhoods here. Boy, isn't that a hard, nasty truth. Love to be able to spin that or even say something about it, but really I can't because that is the literal truth. That is a legitimate thing that has happened and has been happening here in the United States. Parents getting sued for their little girl's lemonade stand because she didn't have a permit is class warfare. Abso-freaking-lutely. Thank you again, John, for that spectacular comment. Absolutely. There's another case where the police wound up harassing two black boys who were selling bottled water at an event out of the back of their trunk. They didn't have a permit, and this was the excuse that the police used to go and harass them, and that actually turned into a police violence case, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's class warfare. You're absolutely right. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Yes, please. I'll take my Soylent Green with some ergot on rye. I know that comment was meant to be totally humorous, but just as an aside, yes. So when people start eating badly, when their food is not good for them, their body is left craving the minerals and vitamins and energy that it needs. But since it's not getting it from food, it starts finding interesting and creative ways to look for it elsewhere. And one of the ways is drugs. We have a massive drug problem in this country. And when I say drug problems, I'm not just talking about illicit substances. I'm not just talking about people becoming all day, everyday stoners. I'm also talking about people on every kind of antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication being prescribed by their psychiatrist, not because they are in fact psychologically like chemically brain damage or chemical imbalance issues, but just because they're depressed and anxious because their lives suck. I mean, I hate to tell you guys this, but if you have depression and anxiety because your life sucks, that doesn't mean you're mentally ill. That means your life sucks and you're mad about it. You're sad about it. You're heartbroken about it. You're anxious about it. That is normal for any being whose environment is not supporting their health and well-being. There's nothing wrong with some of you. There's something deeply wrong with the society we live in. It is causing anxiety, depression, disassociation. Mental health issues are on the rise. And I'm not saying that to dismiss the other side of mental health issues, which are, also very, very real. Okay, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, hey, sleep well, eat well, and all of your mental health issues are going to go away because it's all in your head. And if society was nicer, you'd be fine. That's not the message I'm trying to send, because that's vastly oversimplified. But people who have mental health issues have those issues vastly exasperated by these things. And even people who do not have mental health issues will eventually begin to suffer from good old-fashioned depression and anxiety because the brain requires those chemicals to function properly. A deficit in nutrients, a deficit in sleep creates long-term mental health issues also. Uh, one very thank you, Katie, for this spectacular look. This is great. So class warfare, just like racism, is systemic and structural in its nature in a lot of ways. And Katie's going to give us here an excellent example of the type of structural, systemic class warfare that Americans face every single day. She says one very clear version of class warfare is minimum residence size. There are places where the smallest house you are allowed to build by code is 1,500 square feet. 1,000 square feet minimum is very common, though I myself would prefer a tiny home at just under 200 square feet in total size. And then John Harbeck continues with this thought. Though these days you can totally 3D print a 2,000 square foot home for around $60K, still beyond most income levels, but I could pay the mortgage on it. Yeah, the thing is, you still have to have the land, and he's right. We could 3D print a 2,000 square foot home for around $60,000. Incidentally, adding to Katie's point, so if you 3D printed, say, I would want a slightly larger tiny home than Katie would, but let's just say you 3D printed a 400 or a 500 square foot home. Then the cost of that should be way down to manageable, and it would still, with today's economy, with the way that McDonald's and Target and well, a lot of companies pay, it would still be out of reach for average workers. Schedules are another kind of class warfare. A lot of industries depend almost absolutely on their part-time workers, on forcing workers out before they get retirement benefits, before they hit their 20-year or whatever it is that says that the company now has to start paying you more or maybe giving you a salaried position. So they'll move workers out before they can hit those numbers. And they depend on part-time employees. They depend on fluctuating people's shifts all the time. So you're working mornings for this week or part of this week, and then you work the evening shift, and the next week you come in for the swing shift. Your hours are never stable, so you can never have a life or make any sense of what you can be doing or need to be doing and when. This makes it incredibly difficult for students to attend classes and do well in them. And even if they aren't students, it makes it incredibly difficult really for anybody to plan ever having any kind of life outside of that job, even when they are not actively working. So that kind of screwing with people's lives by screwing with their hours all the time is also class warfare. Yeah, there's a lot of okay, and so that conversation went on, and among other things, we started talking about hempcrete over there in the comments section. Hempcrete is more expensive than 3D printing. It is the kind of earthship building housing that Gen X down is really fascinated by and would like to see the market actually invest in, where we're talking about modest, beautiful size homes made out of sustainable materials, 3D printing and hempcrete and stuff like that. The market for it would be if it was available, if it was really available, out of this world. If the government subsidized this type of affordable housing the way that they subsidize the oil industry and the banking industry, we wouldn't be having this discussion already. It's clearly the way to go. It clearly, if our leaders had any great interest in protecting the economic interests of average Americans, we'd be full on this. But the companies that actually create those, uh, make 3D printed houses and stuff like that, they're for the most part small independent companies. They don't have a ton of government subsidizing, or even a ton of investor interest at this moment. What investors are doing is cash buying entire blocks of houses and then reselling and pricing average people out of the housing market. That's where the investor money actually is right now, not in investing in new and better housing. Uh, so okay, we are at 7:52 this evening. Gone on for about an hour. I think the reason I wanted to cover hemp last week, and I want to cover bamboo, and I want to cover my ecology, and I want to cover a lot of these cheap free energy type solution things is not just because it's better for the environment. It's not just because I've seen way too many heartbreaking photographs of orangutans beating on bulldozers, although that is certainly part of it. But also because I see suffering in the streets of every town every day. We wouldn't treat dogs the way we treat human beings. It, you get on Facebook, every winter you'll see posts that say, if they're cold, or if you're cold, they're cold, bring them inside. And there's always a very adorable picture of a kitty or a puppy. But we leave human beings in that without a thought. Oh, they should have picked themselves up by their bootstraps. What bootstraps? We robbed people. Our society robbed people of their bootstraps and then blamed them for not having them. Look for that narrative in other types of policies too. For example, environmentalism. The entire focus is often on what do the people need to do. Buy fewer products with individual plastic wrapping. Why is that directed at you and not at companies? Stop making products with individual plastic wrapping. Choose reusable grocery bags rather than paper or plastic. Why is that on the consumer? Why haven't grocery stores innovated more effective solutions? Everything's on the consumer. It's average people who are trying to find solutions to get rid of the Pacific waste island, the garbage island floating around the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Average people, children even, are working on that solution. Our government's just like, yeah, that sucks. Billionaires like Elon Musk are, yeah, that's terrible. Even Leonardo DiCaprio, who I do admire. I actually have great admiration for his work, both in film and the environmental work he's doing, which is significant. But they look at stuff like that and they go, gee, I hope somebody fixes that. And then who's fixing it? Well, it was a kid who came up with um, uh, some kind of, I don't know. I read somewhere that there was a kid who actually came up with a viable solution to use a bacteria or something like that to just eat through that garbage pile, and it would basically recycle it back to water. That's spectacular if it's true. But if it is true, why wasn't it immediately implemented? And if it isn't true, why is our media allowed to get away with just saying stuff? Uh, yep. How can you lift yourself up by your bootstraps when you can't afford shoes? Absolutely. Yes, rammed earth around old tires. That first of all, great recycling of old tires, which are otherwise useless. Old tires do, however, make good building structure. And Eddie Izzard for the win. Boy, howdy. Always, 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 always. So that's our show for tonight. Thank you again all so much for being here. And I will see you guys next week. I have no idea what we're going to talk about next week. I have to admit, this show was particularly ill prepared because I didn't spend this week thinking about politics much at all. To be totally honest, I was thinking about D&D more or less to the exclusion of everything else and watching a lot of Critical Role. DM tips and so on and so forth with Matt Mercer, because who doesn't just love Matt Mercer? And then of course Picard, and I had missed a previous week's episode, so this week I got to watch 2 episodes of Picard. Super exciting, and I just love it. But that's our show for tonight, and I do hope that you all have a wonderful week. Whatever is your passion, follow it wholeheartedly. Don't let anybody or anything get in the way of that. And thank you all so much for being here. As always, my dear friends, live long and prosper. Good night.